Yeah, here we go again with Matthias and the Power BI tools. You brought us some new stuff, brand new stuff,
Indeed,
actually.
yes. New release came out earlier today, and yeah, very keen to show what's in it. Um,
Great.
and
So then,
I did a talk with the Seattle user group a week ago where I showed some things in the making, but none of the things were actually available back then. So today it's different. Anything people see, they can actually go away and have a play with immediately if they wanted to.
so best regards to Seattle, and I hope you are watching. That's maybe it's already in the morning there.
Seattle should be, what is it, -8, right? So it's actually midday now, noon.
Oh,
So not too bad. Yeah.
okay, yeah. So maybe there. Yeah. So hello, and yeah, I'm also excited what you have to show us. We produced some new tutorials on my channel, and they're not all. So I already have some ongoing, and of course, this talk will also be some, used to produce new tutorials and make the Power BI tools conquer the world.
All right. Very good. We've got low ambitions here. Let me share my screen.
Yeah,
I remember
I'm
sometimes
waiting for it.
I struggle a little bit with the resolution here. So share screen. Because I can't always see the confirm button, actually.
No, it is okay.
Right, okay, right. So I basically needed to extend it onto another screen. Right, entire screen, and I think it's...
This is something that will be cut away in the tutorials.
Yeah,
So this
very
is a
good.
use case. Okay, yeah, now I see it. So the
Are
stage
you
is
looking?
yours.
Yeah, okay, fantastic, very good. So I just went to GitHub here to the release page for the very latest pbi-tools preview release. As you can tell, released 5 hours ago. Just to explain the rather sort of complicated release numbers. I'm not particularly happy with it either. So basically, I'm a bit shy in terms of making this an official 1.0, right? So I've got some ambitions in terms of what a 1.0 release actually should contain and what feature sets I want to have in it. So I'm basically on my way to getting there. And the RC2, the release candidate 2, is basically a massive sprint, which is all about dataset deployments, right? And originally, I thought, well, it would take 1 or 2 releases to getting there, but it turns out there's so much to be done around having a full end-to-end dataset deployment story. It's actually taking much longer than I actually thought, which is why we basically have the sort of third preview of that data set release in it. Pretty close. All the important things are there already. And there are 3 or 4 features which I'm quite keen on getting done as soon as possible. So just to explain that a little bit. Also, putting this out as a preview pre-release allows me to actually still sort of to have play with certain features and introduce some breaking changes based on input and experience and having worked with certain bits in the real world. So by the time we get to RC2, there we shouldn't see any further breaking changes, actually. So just looking here, this is a full list of what's actually in the box right now. So issue 97 is all about dataset deployments. So that, as I said, continues. Refresh tracing and deploying thick reports, I talked about last time. Non-string deployment parameters, same thing. 146, environment scope parameters. That was a really important one. In a multi-environment setup, you definitely need to be able to actually have different settings and different environments. That's now possible. I'm going to show that. SQL scripts, that's the big one. That's by far the most significant feature, and I'm going to have to spend some time on that. Object-specific refresh allows you to say, for this particular table, I always want a full refresh. For other tables, I want an automatic refresh. Or this particular partition, I want to exclude whenever I run a refresh, right? So previously, it was all or nothing, right? You basically specified the refresh mode for your entire model, and that was it. Now you can be much more granular here. Binding to gateway, very important in order to get the full automation story in place. I'm going to show that in a second. And reporting partition status, reporting data sources, it's much easier done in a demo. All the other things further below were already in the box previously. So let me get started. Let's look at SQL scripts deployments and figure out what that means. What I've done here, I've integrated a really fantastic other open source tool which is called db-up, this is their website. It's an open source GitHub tool, so you can find it on GitHub as well. If you go here, that's the repository, and it's been around for quite a while. It's currently in the 4th major version. It's got what can you see? 92 contributors. It's got almost 2,000 stars. MIT license. So this is actually a fairly well-established library. So what does it do? They say it very nicely themselves. It helps you deploy changes to SQL Server databases. It tracks which SQL scripts have run already and runs the change scripts or only change scripts which are needed to get database. And in conjunction with pbi-tools for datasets, that's actually a very nice combo, and basically allows you to deploy SQL Server dependencies and SQL Server artifacts as part of the Power BI dataset deployment. So let's have a look at what we're getting from this. I've got a Contoso dataset here. In fact, for this one, I used the new Contoso dataset generator, which SQL BI came up with. This one, definitely want to mention that here because it's amazing and it's super powerful. Basically allows you to specify a tiny or a massive Contoso data set, and it will generate a random data for testing. So I've used that one, created a Contoso data set based on a SQL Server database. So if we look into SSMS, I've got a Azure SQL database here, and if I just zoom in a little bit, we can see that's my database. We've got a few standard tables, which most of us will recognize: customer, orders, product, store. And so that runs in SQL Server, and that's what my model is connected to. And what I want to achieve here, and this is actually a pattern I've been using in production for quite a while, and so pbi-tools now supports exactly that pattern. What I want to achieve is where I've got a SQL data source, I want to be able to actually create views which are specific to my model, and I want to maintain those views as part of my database, allowing me to basically push as much of data transformation logic upstream as possible, right? The design goal is to have as little as possible in Power Query in M, and to actually move as much as possible in terms of transformation and joins and whatever into SQL Server, which is obviously, first of all, really powerful, and secondly, that's actually the main reasoning from my point of view. It allows for much better collaboration, I would argue, because most data engineers, at least where I'm coming from, are much more sort of able and capable when it comes to SQL as opposed to M and Power Query. So that's the design goal. What I've got here as part of my dataset repository, I've got a new subfolder, which I'm calling views. And if we go in there and look at customer.sql, we can see there's a select script in here. So allowing me to basically go into SSMS and to open that file and run it and see exactly what's the output here, right? And obviously, this is a very simplified demo. As you can see, there's nothing fancy going on in here, right? So it's basically just a simple mapping. But you can hopefully imagine that in a real world context, you could have some pretty fancy and complex SQL script going on here. And so what I want to achieve is that I can maintain and version and change those views as part of my dataset project. Source control those together, but also deploy them together. And so that's basically what the new SQL scripts feature does. It allows you to basically maintain a folder, which by convention, I'm just calling views here, which it will read from. It will basically iterate through every single file. It will then feed us through a template to basically convert it into a view. And it will then deploy it before running a refresh on a data set. And in order to ensure that you have a proper versioning story, the other thing that happens is that those views are always deployed into a version schema. So if we're going back into SSMS and look into views, we can actually see down here, I've got a pretty verbose schema. So basically the schema name in this particular case is this. It's prefix Power BI to basically distinguish that from any other schemas, to say this is sort of Power BI owned. It's got nothing to do with the rest of the database. And here I'm specifying what's the environment. Here Contoso is basically what's the model, and then 100 is a version number. So you can see you can basically maintain multiple instances of that schema within the same database, corresponding to different environments, as well as corresponding to different versions of the dataset. They can all live side by side. There's no problem whatsoever. And you can have a very nice automated deployment story here. So that's what we want to achieve. And the way we get there is, if we look into our deployment manifest, there's a new option here. Under options, we've got SQL scripts now. And inside SQL scripts, there isn't actually too much going on. So first of all, we're enabling the feature. Secondly, we're specifying the schema we want to use for any deployment. this is a reference to one of our deployment parameters. Then obviously we've got connection information. So this is basically a connection string broken down into the various connection string key value pairs: server, initial catalog, user ID, password. For password, common pattern, we're getting that from an environment variable. And then we're specifying the path containing all our SQL scripts. And we're even getting an HTML report, which we can maintain as a deployment artifact and actually look at later on in order to see what happened. And so pretty straightforward, as you can see, yet really powerful. So how do we convert the select statements into view? This is where this new subfolder comes in. So there's a new convention with a .pbix proj subfolder at the root of our repository, which allows us to maintain an arbitrary number of additional artifacts or templates or anything else specific to particular deployments. So we've got a SQL script subfolder here, which contains 3 files. Template is the one that's used for any file found in this views folder. So basically, I'm reading my select statement for customer.sql, for instance. I'm then injecting the name from that file in here. So that then generates create view with the schema name and the file name. And script content is then obviously everything that's within the file. And so that's going to create a create view statement, and it will execute it. And in conjunction with this one, which is called after update, and that's basically a life cycle script which will always run by convention at a particular point in the deployment pipeline. So it's called after update, which means once the data set's been updated using the XMLA endpoint, this particular script runs, and what that one does is it will basically find any views currently in the same schema, and it will drop them, which then allows us to actually do a create view afterwards. So that's why we always clean up that schema before deploying any new views. And there's also after refresh in here, which is actually scoped to just one particular environment. So if it were called after refresh.sql, it would always run. Because that's called after refresh.development.sql, it would only run as part of the development environment and not for any others. And so that one does a cleanup of schemas. So for instance, I've got 1.0 out there, and I've just deployed 1.1, right? I don't want to have all sorts of old schemas hanging around in my database. I want to clean them up, but only after I've successfully run a refresh to know that I didn't introduce any problems. So and then the final thing we need is to basically wire this up using some Power Query parameters. So we've got SQL schema here. That's basically a parameter which will have the schema name injected, and then in any other query, for instance, this one, we are injecting the server name, the database name, and the schema name before we're actually reading from SQL database. So if we give this one a go, let me actually change. Here we go. Let me actually change the schema name so we can see how it's how the versioning works. So currently, this is what I've got as a parameter. and we've seen that one's already deployed, right? So we've got @100 at the end. If I change this to 110 and then run the deployment for that, it will create the schema. It will then create the views in there. It will deploy the model with a reference to that 1.1 schema. It will run a refresh, and after the refresh, it will then remove the 1.0 schema we've just looked at. This particular database is relatively small, so we can actually look at the whole process end to end. pbi-tools deploy, contoso, and run. I'm not specifying an environment name here because development is the default environment name. So if you don't specify anything, that's what you'll get. That's what you're going to get. We're getting a bunch of outputs now, and I can basically already go over here to my SSMS view, refresh, and now we can see the refresh hasn't completed yet, so we haven't done the cleanup, but we can see that our 1.1 views have been deployed, and those are the ones against which the dataset refresh is currently happening. All right, it's probably done. Yeah, there we go. So it's done. So let's look through those outputs a little bit, because there's quite a bit going on here. So this is where we started, and got an access token. Then we're making a connection to our Power BI workspace. Then the various Power Query parameters are injected with new values. So for instance, very importantly, the schema name we're using for our SQL views is injected here, because obviously that's referenced in all other Power Query queries. We're then saying any SQL scripts are going to be deployed into this particular schema, and they will come from this particular folder. We're testing our SQL Server connection string, and then the model itself is updated. Let's ignore this for the time being, and that one as well. So what's now happening is the update is complete. So the after update.sql script is running, and that one will basically drop anything in that schema. Because it's a new schema, there's nothing to be dropped. So this completes relatively quickly. And then we're deploying the report, and then we're actually getting to db-up doing its thing by iterating through our views folder and deploying every single one of them, ultimately firing a create view statement for each of those 6. And with that in place, we can then do a dataset refresh because we've got all our dependencies. So this is all happening here. We've seen that before. And once we're done, after refresh is running, and that will actually drop all the views from the old schema, the 1.0, and will ultimately drop the schema itself, which means if we go back here and refresh, we can see this is now cleaned up automatically, and we only have the 1.1 in place. Plus, we've got the dataset actually refreshed against any of those views. So yeah, that's probably quite a lot of stuff, quite complex, and I'm assuming I will have to do a few more tutorials around that, but this is out there now. It's in the latest preview. Plus, if anyone is interested in checking out this particular example, it's actually public on GitHub. If you go to pbi-tools organization, this one is called Contoso SQL Dataset DevOps, and basically has all the sources in it we've just looked at. Okay, I'll take a quick breather here. Any
Yeah, I think
questions?
it's big enough to pose the questions now and then to go on with the next topic. So the tutorial cut is done now, but indeed, so it's expected to write views, through normal SQL. So there's nothing like inheritance from the M code is transferred to a SQL view, and this is going back to the database, but it's just like separate from Power BI. You maintain the views, but you deploy it with the same tools.
Correct. Yes. Matthew Roach's maxim, right? Always go and do your transformations as far upstream as possible. This is a literal implementation of that, translated into Power BI terms, if you will, right? Lots of people always worry about query folding in Power Query, right? And lots of blog posts and articles are written with respect to what can be query folded, how do you detect it, and so it's creating a lot of complication because of this abstraction that Power Query introduced. And sometimes I wonder, why are we making our lives so hard? Because what we're trying to achieve here has been solved or was solved 20 years ago in a fantastic way. So don't misunderstand me. I love Power Query, and I would even argue it's one of the most powerful parts of Power BI. But you don't want to overuse it, right? When there are better tools out there, and SQL definitely is an extremely good one when it comes to complex data transformations, use SQL. Don't let Power Query get in your way, right? And so this tooling chain is basically what should allow you to do that in a much better way. In my own production data sets, I've basically over the years I've come up with that exact pattern, right? Coming from, first of all, pushing complex transformations upstream as one principle, thinking about, well, what's needed from a collaboration point of view? How can I make sure that the largest number of people in my team can actually maintain those projects and can reason about those transforms and those views, and also coming from the fact that complex Power Query is incredibly hard to read and reason about, right? So yeah, this is pretty much how I got here. And just going back for once to dbup. So I'm using dbup as a framework and as a library here. But I'm only sort of using it for one very particular purpose, right? Which is basically generating select statements into views. That's actually really not what it's limited to, right? So I'm very keen to see who will come up with some creative and new use cases for this, because this setup here, right, basically running dbup as part of a pbi-tools deployment makes no assumptions with regard to what is actually going on in your SQL scripts, right? I only happen to be using it to create views. You could do anything here, right? If you wanted to, you could even put into your after update SQL, you could insert some rows into a log table, using some parameters from your deployment, for instance, right? So I'm sort of hoping and very keen to see what some creative minds might come up with here, because at the end, the entire power of dbup is actually exposed here. And all you need to understand is that you specify a folder which can be called anything, right? I call it views, but can sit wherever you want. It will iterate through the files in that folder. It will always, by the way, execute the files in strict alphabetic order. So if you have certain ordering requirements, just put a number in front of it to enforce a certain order, for instance, right? Very easy. You can use nested folders, right? So you could theoretically deploy pretty complex sort of database setups as part of this. Let's see what some folks come up with. And then this report path, which I talked about. So as you can see, I'm logging into a .artifacts folder. We've got that up here. There's a HTML file in here. So if we look at that, just opening up on a different screen. So if we look at that over here, so that's what it looks like. It's a HTML file where I can basically click on every single one of my views. It expands and it shows me exactly what's been deployed. So you can imagine this could be quite handy as part of a fully automated system where you actually publish those HTML files and allow people to browse what have you deployed here, right? So yeah, that's the SQL script feature, and I'm assuming I'm going to be talking quite a bit more about this moving forward.
Yeah, so to make it clear, it's separated from the Power BI part. It's just like it can be one part of the project, but I can also imagine to have them separately. So one developer only maintains the SQL part and one developer maintains the Power BI part. It's also possible. And it's for people who know SQL, basically. So it's quite funny you said SQL is easier than M for most people, you know. I think it's not. I know both. I think I consider M to be easier, actually. But I can understand this view, of course. If you're really into databases, you don't want to mess around with all the M, like clicky M features. And this is not the tool to translate M code into SQL. This is a tool to deploy the views for people who already know what they're doing. They are actually expected to maintain them, and they do not see the data actually, like in Power Query. You have to know what you're doing when you edit the views. So, but you also, of course, can just deploy them and then open the view in Power BI. It works. So great stuff, and it's big expanse of the capability of the tools. Nice.
Just one additional note on that one. So just coming back to DB App, if you go to the docs site and click on supported databases, you can see they actually support SQL Server, SQL Azure, SQLite, SQL CE, and then also MySQL, Postgres, and Firebird. So this is a very versatile framework, which is not SQL Server specific, right? This new preview of pbi-tools only has the SQL Server bits in it. And I'm sort of waiting for some feedback and some conversations with guys in the community to find out, is there a need, is there demand, is there interest in supporting additional databases, in which case it won't be a big deal at all for me to put that in there. But I wanted to keep the application as small as possible at this point. So yeah, just that's an important point to note as well. Cool. So that's that one.
Thank you. And I think you have something else.
Yeah. If that's okay.
Yeah, we just go as long as we go today. It was announced, so the longest tool talk ever. But,
right. So let's. I'm just going to stay with the deployment output here because there are a few improvements in terms of diagnostic logging. So this one is something I definitely want to talk about. Basically, after the model update, we're iterating through all model partitions, we're listing them, and we're looking at what's their current state. Also, what's their source type and mode. So source type, as an example, could also be partition policy range, as an example, right? If you're using incremental refresh policies, or mode could be direct query instead of import. So we're getting a full inventory of all partitions currently in the model. And looking at state at this point is quite important, because it could easily say no data or calculation needed, right? Which would give you a good indication of where your model is at. I'm going to rerun this deployment, but after deleting the database, and then we're going to see that the state actually looks different, because after an initial deployment without any refresh ever having run, obviously it's not going to be in a ready state. So again, this is hopefully quite useful in terms of seeing precisely what's going on in my remote model, right? Particularly when you've got a remote maintained partitions there. So that's new. And this particular table is actually generated twice. It's generated once after model update, and then it's generated again after model refresh. So down here. At this point, we don't see any difference whatsoever. It's in a ready state both times, but again, we'll see in a second that it may well be different. So the other big thing is gateway support. If we're going into dataset options, there's a new subsection called gateway. You can specify a gateway ID for your on-prem Power BI gateway. And with that here, any newly deployed dataset will be bound to the gateway automatically. If you put discover gateways in here, it literally does that, right? So after each dataset update, it will basically discover what are gateway candidates, which potential gateways are out there, which, first of all, the deployment principal has access to, and secondly, which actually contains all the data sources my data set has. So we can see that here, discovered gateways. That's the output. There's one discovered, which happens to be exactly the same one I've specified here. That's what it's called. And that one is quite important, again, from an automation point of view. Before this, so the previous release of pbi-tools always required you, after the first time a dataset was deployed, to go into the Power BI UI, to take over the dataset, and then to specify credentials and gateway connections. I want to get away from that, right? So by the time we get to the final RC2, the deployment principal will be able to own the data set throughout its entire lifetime. There will be no need to ever go into Power BI service and do anything manual. And so being able to actually do a gateway connection is one important part of that. Yeah, so that's that. And then the other thing, sorry, we've seen this already. That's not new. We've had that before. This is also not new. Sorry, what am I looking for? Oh, yeah, here. Refresh. I already talked about object-specific refresh types. That's what it looks like, very simple. So previously, we only had refresh type, which is set to full here. And that basically applies to the entire model. Alternatively, I can now specify objects. And then I've got key value pairs, where the key is either a table name or it's a partition name, in which case you would have to specify it like this. So if you want to specify a particular partition, you need to prefix it with the corresponding table name, then put a pipe character in there, and then put the partition name there. And the cool thing here is that you can actually use wildcards. So for instance, if you put something like this, then it would apply to any table that happens to have a partition named info dash and something else, right? So again, can be quite useful, particularly when you run refreshes manually. So there's one particular use case where that's actually really handy. If you remember my previous talks, a convention I'm using very strictly is the info table, which basically just combines various metadata values, allowing you to expose those as model measures in so that your users can actually see them, right? And this normally also has an updated timestamp in it. So if you were to put your model on an automatic refresh mode, this table would never get refreshed, because automatic means the refresh only kicks off when there's actually been a change in the query itself, right? But obviously, this query would always be static. So if you want to make sure that this metadata information always gets updated no matter what, you can do that very easily and very nicely. You can basically say, for my info table, always use full, even when the rest of my model is on automatic, right? So basically, the way those two settings work together, any objects which aren't explicitly specified, they will default to the type that's specified up here, which means with this particular setting, all tables other than info will actually run on automatic. And we can see the impact on that very nicely. If I rerun the deployment now, so basically saving this, if I rerun the deployment, we will now see that actually only the info table will get refreshed. And because of refresh tracing, we can literally see that because it's actually showing up. So if I now do deploy contoso, it will be even faster because the refresh is basically a non-event here. And there we go. That's the report, SQL scripts, refresh, done. And we can see those are our refresh results. Only the info table and the corresponding partition is now showing up because none of the other tables did get refreshed. Because of the automatic setting, the engine determined that there was no refresh necessary. So we basically just spent 200 milliseconds on refreshing that and did nothing else. And that can also be set at an environment level. So that's also possible. I can say by default, everything is automatic, for instance, but say if I'm in production, right? So let's say I have a production environment. I can have different refresh settings here, and then I can say, for instance, everything should be full, right? And then this environment-specific setting will take over, and I will, in production, always get a full refresh. In all other environments, I will get an automatic refresh, and it will only be full for the info table, actually. Yeah, so that's that. And let's well, so the final thing to point out here is the same thing applies to parameters. I mentioned it earlier, right? So previously we had parameters only available at the manifest level. So basically defined for all environments at once. What I can do now is I can what would make sense here? Okay, let's do that one. So I could go in here and actually say only in development my version number should have a def suffix, right? And so with that particular setting, this one will take precedence, right? So anything at the environment level basically overrides what's at the manifest level. And I can even reference from within an environment. I can even reference my manifest level parameters. So in this particular case, I could actually say always take the version number that's specified up here and then suffix it with def in this particular case, which means I only have to maintain it once, right? So that's also possible now. And let's just go back to the demo I promised earlier. So this is the workspace we're currently deploying into. If I drop this entire data set completely, there we go. So nothing left in the workspace now. And if we now go back in and basically deploy this for the first time, because of the gateway bind, we're going to be able to actually not just deploy it, but also get a full refresh the first time around. Obviously, that is only because I happen to have a data source defined on my gateway that matches the data source I'm referencing here. So if I clean this, clear this, here we go. And did I override anything that doesn't make sense? No, we're actually good here. So if I deploy this now, again, using development, we will see, there we go. So the version now actually has the 100 from the manifest, and then also has the environment-specific suffix. And we will now see not only does it discover a gateway, but it also binds to the gateway and it kicks off a refresh. And again, that's only possible because of the gateway connection. It's all set to automatic now, but in this particular case, automatic means full because obviously we wouldn't have had any data in any of the partitions. So if we now go back to the partition report here, so that's the one which is now different, right? So this is a new data set that didn't exist in the workspace. First time round, we only did a metadata deployment. So all of my partitions show up as having no data, which means I can't query my data set. And then we bind to our gateway. I'm just trying to find where that actually happens. Model deployment. Here. Oh, okay, sorry. So this is where it's happening. So this is where the gateway bind takes place. And then we're doing refresh. And then we can see now all my partitions are ready. If I go back to my workspace and open the corresponding report, I will see that it actually has data in it. So yeah, this is a very important step to, one, supporting multiple environments with different settings, and two, actually being able to get closer to fully automated setup where no manual intervention is necessary. Happy to have a chat here or take some questions.
Wow, cool stuff. You already introduced the parameter thing in the last talk, and now it's done. So
Mm-hmm.
you can see how fast the development goes. I see Andrea is watching, so if you want to get into stream, just give me a live sign by, I don't know, just activating your camera or micro. Otherwise, questions are always welcome, but there are no questions in the chat in our
Mm-hmm.
evening talk. However, it's a lot of good content that will stay forever here, and I will make some good tutorials of it. So yeah, but this part was quite understandable for me. And one question for me, but it's not directly related to your tools. So Microsoft kind of thing it's kind of introduced in some the web editor of Power BI will become more powerful end of the year with the goal to, yeah, of course, transfer the report building into the cloud. And when it will be a part of Azure DevOps natively.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about it? So I think there are still some advantages in using Power BI tools, especially the uh, yeah, professional functions that will be not available so fast. And I see you also in competitive advantage to other external tools because you use the API. So you can easily deploy to web
Mm-hmm.
environment.
Well, I mean, one way of looking at it would be to say, uh, with pbi-tools, you have a lot of features available today, which Microsoft is currently promising to
Mm,
some sort of indefinite point in the future, right? So, in a way, if you're very keen on actually setting up a more automated and more uh, governed and process oriented deployment and development process, you can do that today. You don't have to wait a year or so
mm,
to see what may happen at that point, right? Which also, because at the end of the day, it's not just technology, right? I mean, we all love technology, and we get excited, coding or looking at VS Code and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's actually about process. It's about buy-in in your organization. It's about your team actually getting on board with a different way of thinking about production versus development. It's about uh, your ability to be very agile and quick in putting things out there without compromising on quality and controls, right? So, and those are oftentimes transitions and organizational changes which take a long time and which require many iterations and lots of sort of learning and trial and error, right? So um, if that's something we can get more folks to be invested in right now and to think about and come up with better ways of doing things, then that would be a huge success from my point of view, right? And it would just mean that more and more people would actually be ready for whatever Microsoft solution may come out at some point.
Yeah, great statement. And yeah, there only like appreciation in the chat. So great feature from Andrea. Thanks. And also my colleague Imad also saying nice. Yes, we like it. So yeah, only thanks and no questions on this point. Clear for me, very clear and not much to explainable feature. The first one was surely more explainable, but you took the time. So I just say thank you, and maybe like in last minutes before we come to 1 hour of links and the longest tool talk ever. So you're also speaking at lots of events, right? The next time. So what are your next free events or meetups?
Well, it's a bit of you can definitely tell that it's summer right now, right? So things have are much more quiet, uh, understandably, right? From my point of view, it's actually getting prepared for conferences more so than
Mm,
user groups or live
mm,
streams. I've got 3 conferences coming up in September. So my summer is extremely busy, actually getting ready for that. It's 2 in-person conferences in Chicago and Denmark, and then it's also an online conference. SQL, Power BI, Power BI Virtual Summit. Is that what it's?
eh, you-
Something Virtual Summit. Sorry,
I heard about it.
I should really I should really know better. So yeah, that's happening in September. There is SQL community
Mm.
SQL Data Community Summit coming up in Seattle. I think I got the name wrong as well. So that's Seattle, also in person, but not till November. But also something
Okay.
I'm getting ready for right now. In terms of user groups or so, we'll need to see. Nothing in the diary at this point.
Okay, but it's quite a lot when you think about the conferences. I think the one in Denmark is Power BI Next Step.
Yes, correct.
So quite interesting conference in Legoland.
Yeah.
And
At that one, I'm going to talk about jointly with Mike Harlow. Actually, we're going to talk about incremental refresh, but also advanced partition management.
oh,
And you can see how things are connected, right? So obviously, if I go back here and we're actually looking at reporting partition state and making um, providing more visibility around the various partitions in your data set, as well as providing ability to handle different partitions differently, you can see where that's leading, obviously. So yeah, super excited about all of those. Really, Chicago. I'm doing something slightly different actually, which I'm also mega excited about. I'm doing a well, career development / soft skills session. So not a technical topic at all. I'm going to talk about basically the learnings from my own experience from the last 5, 6, 7 years of transitioning from a technology specialist, single contributor, to actually becoming a manager and a team lead, not just taking on building a team in an enterprise context, but also taking that same team, through various new stages, allowing people to evolve, grow into bigger roles. And I'm going to do a talk looking back of all the things I've learned during that journey, and all the things I wish I didn't have to learn the hard way, basically. Right. So I want to give some advice and some insights and some stories to anyone who thinks they're in a similar position. Either considering, should I aim to go onto a manager path, is that the right thing for me? Or people who are already there and who wonder, oh, maybe maybe I shouldn't have made that change, and maybe it's not right for me. I want to provide some guidance to everyone in that position, so they don't have to go through the same difficult learnings I did and have it slightly easier. If that's the outcome, for some of the attendees, it's going to be a huge success from my point of view.
Oh, wow, this was a big pitch. So definitely must see. I hope I will catch this talk too. So you're not talking about your tools. So obviously you're talking also about other technical topics, but also about non-technical topics. It's not advertisement show for the tools, but just
Mhm.
the community stuff we are doing here. And to close up, I think when every manager would have such a passion of looking into the outputs in the terminal, there would be a much better world. So see you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.